This is a project that I started with some co-conspirators who are here today. I've got Judith Brand-Ingber, Cecily Marcus, Linda Shapiro, and we're missing Nancy Mason-Hauser. Also were my consult as we put together this series. And this first one is actually in partnership with BodyCartography Project and fall 2014 Contact Improv programming that's in partnership with the Art Center's Steve Paxton Festival that's coming up in November. Today is the history of local contact improvisation, and you know, when I first moved to the Twin Cities, there were some elements of the dance community that I noticed right away, and the oral history that happens. A lot of, I would hear stories. I'd meet somebody new and be like, oh, well, you know, that used to happen here, and oh, I used to take classes with so and so, and a lot of it still feels really fresh. And so having this time together to kind of collectively remember some of our history, it reminded me of growing up in Canada. In fact, the license plates say "Je me souviens," and the French are very nostalgic, so it makes sense that these license plates say "I remember," but it actually literally translates to "I remind myself," and so that's what I felt like today would be. It's like we remind ourselves of our own history. So with that, we'll get started. Although my first speaker just ran to the other side of the room. So I'll just pause.
Well, you can tell them what this is.
Oh yeah. So in the background, some of the research we were doing as a team, we were pulling out all kinds of images and videos from archives, and this is a documentary that was created around a project with Danceability, and it was the last project before New Dance Performance Lab closed. And so Linda Shapiro will talk more about that, but just having the images in the background, like a way to start looking forward by looking back. All right, all Bieringa.
So awesome you're all here, and really also exciting for me that this is happening at the Cowles. We've been doing, I think since the beginning of September, classes and jams upstairs in the education studio, which have been fantastic. If anyone's interested in actually coming and putting your body back into what is contact improvisation, there's been about 20 to 30 people there every Monday night, taking class with different teachers in the community and jamming. So I'm very excited. Thank you, Michelle, so much for the opportunity to kind of reconnect with this community, because I do feel like there's a history, and there's been a very strong history of this work in the Twin Cities, but there's also a contemporary reality, and the form has really, I think, it has the tendency to appear and disappear, like it has waves of popularity and function around it over time for different people. So it's just nice to be able to refresh and re-engage with what it has to offer. I'm going to just read you a little short history that Lisa Nelson and Nancy Stark Smith wrote in 1979 about the sort of beginning moments of contact improvisation. Lisa is coming with Steve in November to perform together a piece they've developed together at the Walker. And Lisa and Nancy together have co-edited Contact Quarterly, which is this amazing publication. There's some copies over here if you don't know about it and you want to have a little look at it. So here we go. I'll read a little bit. During a Grand Union residency at Oberlin College in January 1972, Steve Paxton made a work for 11 men in which they threw, caught, flung, collided, and fell among one another continuously for 10 minutes. And then they stood for a few minutes. The dance was called Magnesium. That spring, while teaching at Bennington College, Steve met with two students, Leon Felder and Nita Little, who had been stimulated by similar curiosity with the physical force forces that affect motion, experimenting with lifting, falling, exchanging weight with mutual support. And in June 1972, with funding from Change Incorporated, Steve gathered with about 15 of the best athletes that he could find to run a course, in the course of a year or two of his teaching, both men and women, and people were going to explore together the principles and potential of communication first evident in magnesium. The first week they spent in rehearsal, and then the second week was in the context of a public showing at the Weber Gallery in New York City. They spent 5 hours a day in the gallery practicing together contact improvisation. The event was called Contact Improvisation, and that included some of the performers, Barbara Dilley, Mary Fulkerson, who was one of my teachers, Danny Letkoff, Nina Little, Bert Siddell, Nancy Stark-Smith, who's taught here, Nancy Toff, amongst others. Inspired by this event, they worked continuously, and in 1973, Steve, Kurt, Nancy Stark-Smith, Nita Little, and Karen Radler came to the West Coast performing and leading workshops in contact improvisation under the name You Come and We'll Show You What We Do. The ambience of the work and performance continue to be informal. No music, special lighting or costume, audiences in the round, duets and trios interspersed with solo dancing. In June 1973, Steve brought a group to Europe for the first time to perform in Rome. In 1974, Nita, Kurt, and Nancy were in the San Francisco Bay Area, teaching the form to others and developing more dance mates and developing a context for the work's expansion. Joined by Steve Paxton in 75, they formed Reunion, the first formal contact improvisation company, meeting once a year to tour to the West Coast with performances and classes. The continuing dialogue concerning context development soon included hundreds of other individuals and groups. And Contact Quarterly, which was formerly called the Contact Newsletter, was initiated by Reunion in 1975, edited and produced by Nancy Stark-Smith, to foster communication among the geographically dispersed teachers, performers, and practitioners of contact. So, then, just to say, because this is a very important thing about the form was never copyrighted, it was never formalized as something that was owned by anybody. It's always been something that has been driven by interest. So this is something that Steve wrote and was actually said in 1983 at a contact symposium. What's at stake in the contact network actually is very little. You know nothing particular to gain that is immediately apparent by being part of this network. Nothing particular to lose if you decide to stop. And you can rejoin again without any kind of heavy commitment. To me, that is refreshing. There is no commodity. It's almost like you're following your own mind. If you're slightly interested, very interested, or on up that scale, then it's easy to be in it. If you're not interested, very uninterested, or bored, or whatever, then you're not a part of it. And that's about the scale of it. It only survives through actual interest, and that's the energy that's maintaining it as a practice and as a form. One other lovely thing, too, from Patrick Scully, that Patrick just found from Heath, Hennessy, which is also just indicative, I think, of the formation of contact, which kind of developed through the 60s, but really emerged as a form, or was identified by Steve in the early 70s and then developed by this whole community of practitioners, is that in 1980, there were 13 contact improv companies in the USA and Canada. In 1980, Reagan was elected and things changed. By 1982, there was not one CI company still in existence. So it speaks to a need, it speaks to also what gets funded, it speaks to this idea of ownership, it speaks to the idea of practice and also the relevancy even as contact as a social practice or a performance form. I think there's many layers to this work that are inspiring. Just to cite my own relationship to the form very quickly, and then I would like to kind of get out of the way. I really came to dance through contact improvisation, through improvisation, and through dancing in nightclubs. Actually, I studied jazz ballet when I was younger. But I really had this kinesthetic drive that was not something that was fitting into the model of dance trainings in the era that I was growing up. And I met Michelle in the Netherlands at the School for Center for New Dance Development in the early 90s. And, for example, met Kristin at the Contact Improvisation 25th year anniversary. So there's all these changes in Ohio. I met Otto also at a Contact Improvisation and Mixed Ability event with Karen Nelson on Basher Island. So there's all these pieces of sort of dance history, I think, that don't just bring in, that are about the local community, but then there are also all these things that build relationship geographically to our community, which is an international community. Contact thrives not just in the States, it really thrives in certain parts of Europe and Argentina and Israel, where there's like multiple jams running a week. And I think in the Twin Cities, as we can hear, there have been on and off periods of more contact action and less, but I think that's maybe enough history for now from the larger frame. Yeah, so thank you.
Excuse me, could you introduce yourself? I don't even know.
My name's Olive Bieringa, and together with Otto, actually, I co-direct the BodyCartography Project. So, is that loud?
That'd be nice for everybody to introduce themselves before they speak,
Right.
because some of us aren't in the dance.
Great, okay. And this is Patrick Scully.
Sorry, my name is Michelle Steinwald. I get nervous, so I forget to say my name.
And Michelle works here, and I hope we'll all get a chance to know who's who here.
Yes.
So my name is Patrick Scully, and in 1975 on, I purposely did not make enough of these, so share these, because this is in the spirit of contact in the early days, where it's not an individual thing, it's a collective experience. In the summer of 1975, I hitchhiked to Washington, D.C. to take classes for a month at the American Dance Festival. That summer I was in Washington, D.C. at Wolf Trap Academy. And when the festival started, they had two artists that they introduced to all of the dancers who were there, because they were going to be teaching a dance form that nobody knew anything about. And they wanted to sort of promo these two people to encourage people to be exposed to the form. And so that's where I first saw Steve Paxton and Nancy Stark-Smith. And I took my first contact classes from the two of them, and it totally freaked me out. It was like you just learned how to hear and you arrived in battle. It was especially that level of physical contact with that many people that I didn't know was sensually and erotically like so overstimulating that like my system just kind of shut down. It was like more than I could handle. It would be like somebody saying to you, get in the car and drive from St. Paul to Minneapolis at rush hour and have a leisurely drive. You know, it was like to focus internally that much and have that much external stimulation was for me impossible. So, summer of 75. January 1976, Mary Cerny, member of Nancy Hauser's dance company at the time, comes back from a year's sabbatical, I believe it was a year, in the Bay Area, where she had been taking classes with Nita Little in contact improvisation. That's the flyer that I just passed around, was the flyer for Nita's first contact improv classes in the Bay Area. Mary started teaching these classes here, and I took the classes in a setting at the Guild of Performing Arts that I was familiar with mostly other people that I also knew, and all of a sudden it wasn't babbled anymore. It was as if somebody introduced me to my native language. It's like, this is the language that my body understands. And so Mary taught the winter series, she taught a spring quarter thing at the Guild, And then she left to go to England to be closer to Mary Fulkerson and do some work together with Mary, and left behind a bunch of eager students. And some of us decided that we would just form what we called at the time the Contact Work Group. Very kind of proletarian name in the spirit of the time. And the work group was initially open to anybody that wanted to come. But after we had worked together a few times, we realized we didn't want to have to keep introducing people. And we wanted to be able to build on what we had already done. And so at some point we became a closed group. And actually it evolved to where we called ourselves Contact Works. And we were engaged really in teaching each other and teaching classes for the public. We were engaged in performing, and our performing in Contact Works was mostly local, but got as far from here as Cleveland, Ohio, and Ann Arbor, Michigan. And but in addition to teaching and performing, we also rehearsed together. We rehearsed together 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. The teaching that we did was for adults. It was also in colleges when we did residencies various places, and it was also work that we did in public schools, in elementary schools, and high schools. And with that, I'm going to start playing one of the first video clips that I have here.
Patrick, when was that Oakland event?
When was what?
The Oakland event?
Oakland, this would have been in 1974, 74, 75, I'm not sure. There's, like most dance posters, there's no date on it. Let's see if this is the...
Nancy was a student at Oberlin when that first performance of Contact happened. That's how she got into Contact.
So there's actually some audio here.
This is Nancy Stark Smith on the right.
So that's Nancy Stark Smith dancing with Jay Smiley, and this was actually a documentary videotape that Wendy Oliver made of Contact Works. So we're here in what was later the Ozone Studio, or it might have at that time actually been the Ozone Studio. But in this documentary, this is Dome City, for those of you that remember the dance space in Dinkytown at 15th and University. That's Joanne Tillemans and Wendy Oliver dancing together. Here we are in our first studio. It's now a Somali coffee shop on Bloomington Avenue between 25th and 26th Streets. And these videos are all available on YouTube, and I've got a handout that I'll pass out later on, and so you can have these links and go and watch the entire video. But I think it's helpful to just see images from back then in the mid-70s of what Contact Improvisation looked like at the time. That's Whitney Ray and Wendy Oliver with the braid, and that's me sitting next to the pole there on the wall. And the woman with the dark hair sitting to my left is Joanne Tillemans. This is David Critchard's studio in the same building as what was the New French Bar and New French Cafe. It's a very important performing space in the late 70s. This was our space that later became the Xenon Dance Studio by the Little Wagon on 5th Avenue in South Minneapolis. The lighting here was done by Jeff Bartlett. This was for an evening that had both improvised pieces and choreographed works based on the vocabulary of Contact Improvisation. So I mentioned that one of the things that we did was we taught, we performed, we rehearsed, but we also produced a lot of stuff. thank God for Wendy Oliver. She got a lot of the stuff that we did recorded and documented it and put it together and edited things. But we produced a lot of jams as well, and we produced a lot of other artists from the Forum coming to the Twin Cities. Mangrove came here a couple times. There was a collective from Ann Arbor, Michigan called Mirage that we would do exchanges with. We would do all the legwork for them performing and teaching here. They would do all the legwork for us performing and teaching in Ann Arbor. Because sometimes those financial relationships got tricky. Like Mangrove, when they would come to town, sometimes assumed that we had resources like we were the Walker or the University of Minnesota, but we were just this collective working together. And I remember one big unpleasant argument that we had about the contract that they had signed when they came to Minneapolis, which I had to say, you know, they said, well, when we're touring, we're either usually sponsored by a big institution or the local grassroots community. But when we come to Minneapolis, somehow we're somewhere in between. And I was like, no, we are the local grassroots community. We've just got our shit together. So when you come and you see, and you have really good turnouts for your shows, and you have a lot of people in the classes, it's because of the work that we're doing here in the community. And we need to be paid for some of that. So, we also sponsored them with the American Dance Guild, the University of Minnesota, and Walker Art Center, the American Dance Guild's Art Sport Conference that happened in June of 1980. And that was mostly in buildings at the University of Minnesota. I remember walking into a gym, in Norris Gym at the U, one of the large gymnasiums, and there were a couple hundred people stretching and rolling around each other and doing contact, and it was like the early days of contact for me, of like too much stimulation. I made sure they opened another gym that had fewer people in it so that you could go and do contact and maybe have more than 6 square feet of space around you. But then there was a performance. All of the different groups that came to town had a maximum of 15 minutes on stage in a performance series that was done in the proscenium stage in Rarick at the university. And we decided as the home group to claim the right to perform first, because it was sort of like the Contact Olympics. It was more competitive than Contact had ever been, because there were all of these people from everywhere showing each other, and everybody wanted to do well and be well represented, and people were nervous and scared. And so I'll just play you a little clip of our performance.
Now is an improvisational performance done during the American Dance Guild Conference in June of 1980 in Minneapolis. In this case, the score involves the use of alarm clocks.
So you see here already there's a shift from some of the earlier black and white video, but just in terms of sophistication, it's being shot by more than one camera and edited together. We're paying attention to what each of us are wearing so that as a collective it makes sense what we're wearing and it isn't all just sort of haphazardly thrown together. And like I said, this is available on YouTube, and if you're interested and want to watch the rest of it, you can. I'm just going to turn down the sound here so that I can be heard over it. We also sponsored, we realized all these contact people from all around the world really were coming to Minneapolis for this art sport conference. So we organized another week conference to happen immediately afterward that we called After Art Sport. And the focus of that was strictly contact improvisation. Art sport was more broad in its scope and more sort of embracing of any and all kinds of improvisation. We wanted to have a week that was just for contact improvisation. And it was really a time in which like the whole contact world was like really focused right here locally in Minnesota. So During that time, there's just a couple other things that I want to mention. We performed at a lot of places around town. We were invited by the Walker to curate a choreographer's evening. We performed works through young audiences. We had a children's show that we did in elementary schools all around the state. We performed at Worthington's Community College, Bemidji State University, St. Mary's and St. Teresa's down in Monona. And we were really very engaged as a touring and performing and teaching company at the time. We also had a lot of quiet supporters behind the scenes, people like Nigel Redden, whose tastes and preferences for postmodern dance meant that he noticed what we were doing and gave us opportunities and sometimes letters of introduction to other people that made life a little bit easier and sort of smoothed the way and made connections for us. It was also where I first met Jeff Bartlett and began to work with him. Jeff did a lot of our lighting. Well, actually, almost all of our lighting. It was a rare show that we did that Jeff didn't light. But by 1980, it was time for me to leave Contact Works after 4 years of being involved in it, because I got to a place where I realized that I needed to define my voice as a gay man in the work that I was doing. And as the only GLBT person in Contact Works, I didn't feel oppressed by that group, but I didn't feel like I was going to find the answers that I needed there. And my travels took me, and my searching took me to work with Rusapora, took me to work with Remy Charlotte, and the piece that I did with Lance Westergaard was no contact experience at all, but when Nancy Stark-Smith saw that performed in 1984, exactly 30 years ago this weekend, she said, "This is the first successful marriage of contact improvisation and classical ballet." I also, through Jim Tyler, who was one of the founding members of Mangrove, met Pooney Dodson, who later danced with Bill T. Jones, and Pooney and I did a few collaborative pieces together. And then ultimately, Chris Aiken eventually made his way to Minneapolis, and I saw Chris when he was auditioning for met Chris when he was auditioning for the Out There series. I believe it was in 1990, and he and I started working together very soon after that. And this is me performing with Chris at the New York Improv Festival in 1994. And our work together was mostly on, but occasionally off, depending upon just his kind of connections and work, and whether when we were in town together, he was off to graduate school. But my work in Contact, unlike many people whose work in Contact was very jam-focused, my work was usually focused around having a tight ensemble that I worked with for a significant period of time and developed a kind of depth of communication. First experiencing that with Contact Works, then experiencing that with Pooney, and then with Chris, and then while I was still dancing with Chris, I initiated a project that brought me in contact from the Twin Cities even more than my work with Chris did. I worked with Keith Hennessy and Ishmael Houston Jones, wanting to sort of bring a queer flavor to the world of contact improvisation, and in particular, that I felt was often absent. And I wanted to bring it there in a way that was really clear and unmistakable. And so Keith and Ishmael and I got together and created a completely improvised series that we called Unsafe Unsuited. And all we knew was that we would be on stage for about an hour, and that we didn't have a plan other than that. And a guy from a local television station came and shot this preview of us rehearsing together. You'll recognize the walls of the Southern Theater there. And over a period of 6 years, we performed this in Twin Cities, San Francisco, New York, Houston, San Antonio, Washington, D.C., Torino, Italy, and a few other places that I'm probably forgetting. We got an amazing review from Deborah Jowett for this work. dancer where you realize that the critic is explaining things to you so that you understand it in a way that's more complex than you understood your own work before you read what the critic had to say. It was one of the gifts of being able to be reviewed by someone with as much experience as Deborah Jowett had.
How'd you do that in Suits? Sorry.
After Unsafe, Unsuited, probably one of the major things, two other things that I'll mention just in terms of my ongoing work. In 2006, I helped to organize the 30-year reunion of Contact Works that mostly happened at Patrick's Cabaret, but part of which also happened at the Walker. And then I would say that my work with Contact, even in the most recent work I did, Leaves of Grass Uncut, working with a cast of 17 dancers, some of whom were experienced in Contact, some of whom were not, but the knowledge and influence of Contact improvisation is unmistakable, I think, in the nature of all of the dance work that I continue to do here. So as Olive said, there's sort of an ebb and flow of how this web of Contact improvisation gets created. There are times when some people are more active, some people are less active. But I would like to just articulate that it happens sometimes through classes, whether that's for adults or college students or people in schools, kindergarten through 12. It happens by the establishment of spaces. The spaces that Contact Works had were always spaces that jams happened in. Jams still frequently happen at Patrick's Cabaret on a sort of off and on again schedule. The ebb and flow and the web is built through individuals and organizations. Sometimes connections happen. Orlando, a show first produced by Illusion Theater in 1977. Bonnie Morris of Illusion Theater took classes from Mangrove when they were in town and made a connection that allowed Illusion Theater to perform Mangrove in San Francisco in Mangrove space when they were there in the late 70s. It happens sometimes through the way that policies are established. The influence of Contact improvisation has made it such that nobody questions that an improviser should be eligible to apply for a dance grant, for dance grants that are generally given to choreographers. And that wasn't always the case and isn't necessarily always the case other places. But that's something that I think has been part of the culture here. It also impacts the world of critics, and there's a back and forth in that world. And I will say that locally, I was glad that before he passed, I was able to establish a connection with Mike Steele that I felt comfortable with, because it was my experience that Mike, as articulate as he was as a writer about dance, got confused sometimes when it came to improvisation. And I think part of his confusion was centered around the fact that I was very prominently engaged with that locally, and I was an out gay man, and he was a gay man on the other side of Stonewall, and we actually had an opportunity to talk about that. But it impacted what got written about and what didn't get written about. And so that interplay between what gets noticed and what doesn't, sometimes it's because of the aesthetic of the form, sometimes it's because of the identity of who's doing the form. But that importing and exporting has always been something that Minneapolis hasn't been a major hub of, but Minneapolis has been a significant player in the 30-plus years that Contact improvisation has existed as a form. And I'm just going to switch here. I realize in talking about what I've talked about that there are lots of other things that I could have talked about, but I've only got so much time, and I also wanted to talk about the things that I was personally most involved in. But I'm just going to, at random, pick a clip here, and it's also by way of bringing up our next speaker. My work together with Chris Aiken also intensified my opportunities to dance together with Jane Shockley, and this is 1999 at Patrick's Cabaret, an improvised trio that Chris and Jane and I performed. Thank you very much. Do you want me to keep this playing?
No, you can shut that off, because I'll be very distracted by it. So, as Patrick said, my name is Jane Shockley, and in preparing for today, I was racking my brain. Where did I first, what was my first introduction to Contact? And I was an original member of Xenon Dance Company, so 8 years of choreographers. I then danced with New Dance Ensemble, which was a company that Linda Shapiro directed, and a year of choreographers. And then she started New Dance Performance Lab, which was basically 4 years of choreographers. So this huge amount of people that I actually worked with. And I'm like, who was the first person that introduced me to Contact? And then I walked in here today, and there's Rick Watson. And he's like, Jane, hi. Yeah, I think I taught you at UMD. And I went, oh my God, you're kidding me. Rick Watson taught a workshop at UMD where I was a student. I have no recollection of it at all because it was college. So again, these sort of, these webs of people that kind of come into my life. And so then I, of course, went, oh my gosh, I have no idea. And then I went back to sort of the choreographers that I worked with. And I believe the first choreographer that actually introduced me to Contact Improvisation was Randy Warshaw, who danced with Trisha Brown, and he did a piece on Xenon. And I have some sort of odd recollection of doing some kind of partnering work with him in this piece. And then I was, in preparation for this today, I was going through my journals. And like all my journals, there's names and quotes and pictures and half everything. And I see at the top of one page, BB, Scott, Ernie, People, Krista. And then underneath that was Contact, must pursue. And I'm like, oh my God, what was that? And I think that was my reflection of B.B. Miller's performance at the Ordway. She did a dance called Double Duets. Does anyone remember that? B.B. Miller. It was obviously choreography that was inspired by Contact Improvisation, and it was double duets in absolute unison. And I went, oh my God, must do. However, I can't quite remember the timeline, if that was before or after. I was a student at Bates Dance Festival, and at the time, it was in the era of Xenon / jazz dance, and Danny Berchevsky was the co-artistic director of Xenon / jazz dance, and he was teaching at Bates Dance Festival, and I was a student there, and he asked me if I would perform a duet with him in the faculty concert called Merry-Go-Round, and I was like, sure, why not? So it's tech night, and I'm standing in the wings, waiting, to do the piece. And this group of people is out there on stage. And they're rolling around and laughing and, and I know for sure it was Andrew Harwood. And I'm not sure who the other 3 people were. And I'm going, oh my God, there's no music. They have no idea what they're doing. And then Andrew says, to the lighting designer, he's like, yeah, after, I don't know, about 12 minutes, you can take the lights out. And I went, you're kidding me, that's no counts, no true beginning, no true end. And I just went, I've got to do this. And I think at that point I realized the term contact improvisation. That was sort of the first, I was like, what is that? Okay. So I came back to Minneapolis, and shortly thereafter, Chris Aiken moved to town. And Chris Aiken was from Boston, and he moved to town because his wife, Kathy Young, danced with Xenon/jazz dance. And he brought his collaborative partner, Olivier Besson, to do a workshop / showing upstairs in Xenon Space 4A. So I'm sitting there, and no, that wasn't the round. They'd often perform in the round, which was also like, oh, mind-blowing to me who had come from dancing on a proscenium stage. And I watched the performance, and then I turned around, and there was Patrick sitting behind me. And I kind of knew who he was. And I turned around and I said, I think I introduced myself. And I asked Patrick, do you teach contact improvisation? Because I'm really interested in studying it. And I can't quite remember what the answer was. I think you said, I'm not at this time, or something like that. So, Chris Aiken, the Aiken era, as I call it, he really sort of became kind of the anchor of my intentional learning of contact improvisation. And also, like Patrick, I had, in one of my journals, I had written down contact improvisation. I feel like I am home. So it's like, once I started doing that, it was, it was meant to be. And it felt very natural for me to just be in this room full of people rolling and very close contact. I actually was really kind of wanted more of that charge that was like, yes, bring it on, because I had been, sort of in this little don't touch me kind of world for a long time. So when I got into this room of people touching, I was like, yes, more. So Chris decided he wanted to form an improvisational group. So we formed Body Logic. Chris Aiken, his wife Kathy Young, Olivier Besson, and myself. And basically we taught workshops here and out east in Florida. We performed. All of our performances were with music, because Chris was really interested in improvisational movement and improvisational music. What's his name? Julian Hamilton. The drummer. Peter? No. I can't remember. His last name is Hamilton.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Yeah. So, what's that?
It is Peter, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, Peter Hamilton. So we did, just basically open performances or open scores for as long as we could handle it. Jeff, again, was often the lighting designer, so it was improvised music, improvised lights, improvised movement. So it was really an all improvisational experience. And so Chris, being from out of town, had all these connections everywhere else. So he brought in, I have all these names written down. Oh. In 1996, John Kalaki at the Walker decided to bring in improvisers from around the country. and he thought he would call it the Improvisational Summit. Sounds fair. So who came in that summit was Nancy Stark-Smith, Holly Motley, Jeff Bliss, Julie Carr, Ray Chung, Olivier Besson, Chris Aiken, myself, and John Jaspers. So it was a week-long teaching, and then a final performance at the Walker. And I was starstruck. Most of the performance, I was like this against the wall. I come out, then I go out. Plus, I just had my daughter, so it's a good excuse. So there was that. And then there was the lab days, I call it, where I danced with Linda's New Dance Performance Lab. And basically it was a laboratory where choreographers could come in and work from anywhere from 2 weeks to a month, and they didn't have to have any product. So it was all process. And there was a few choreographers that I worked with that I think used contact improvisation to really develop the work. And one of them was Bill Young. And he's a choreographer in New York. And I just remember standing in a group, and he's like, okay, why don't you move through each other? Okay, why don't you add a little weight? Okay, why don't you jump and catch? And sort of building this score through that. And then of course the Danceability Project with Alito Alessi was probably for me personally, because how else can it not be profound experience to work with differently abled bodies.
And that was the first video we had on.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. And this is where I actually kind of realized that anybody can do contact improvisation. And it's also where I realized that my sort of prowess as a dancer didn't matter at all anymore. Working with Bonnie Dunn, she was a dancer that came with Alito. She moved at this pace. However, when she started falling, so to sort of be in that space with this body, and also with Arlene, is that her name? The blind woman. It was just incredible. It really was, and it kind of, it brought to the forefront that what contact improvisation is all about, is just being together and really listening to each other, and what can come from that. And okay, I'll go on. So Chris, still in the Aiken era, he brought in many people to teach workshops and also to perform with. One of them being Peter Bingham, another of them being Andrew Harwood, Kirsty Simpson, and he did a performance at the Southern with, I think it was Steve Paxton, Kirsty, Ray Chung, and this group of people. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I had the after party, my house. I'm so excited because Steve Paxton was coming, and I'd get to like pick his brain. So we're in the kitchen, getting our food, eating, and I walk outside, and I had a porch with a porch swing. There's Steve sleeping on my porch swing, and I went, perfect, just the way it should be. So that was my Steve Paxton story. Yeah, exactly. Right. And I did some teaching upstairs at Xenon, where I was first introduced to Kristin. Kristin came to my class right out of college. Imagine this. Kristin Van Loon in a black unitard. Her hair up in a bun. Was it shiny? Yes. Walks in. Yes. Yeah, it was. Walks in, stands in front of the class, just like, and I said, roll down the spine. And she rolled down and she started stretching. I'm like, it's okay, you can relax. And then I said, we're going to do some contact improvisation. And I had just talked to Kristin before, and she said that was really the first moment that she put contact and improvisation together. So, yeah, she's loosened up a lot. Obviously. Exactly. Yeah. And then I had the opportunity to go to Bright Bush Jam, which is a week-long jam that happens in Oregon. And it's this beautiful place with pools, hot water pools, beautiful dance space. And I met Jess Curtis there, who is from California. And I produced a workshop for him upstairs in 6A, when 6A was still a studio. And he was really also sort of a defining force for me to continue to do contact, because I had met him after I had my daughter, and I was, feeling, and he came in and really had that athleticism that I really was craving. So he kind of, brought me kind of back into the fold of contact. And, Ishmael Houston Jones. When you said that name, all of a sudden, I took a workshop with him at Minneapolis Community Technical College. Yeah. And it was an improvisation. I don't know if it was contact improvisation, but I remember walking around and he said, let's walk around and say the colors that you see. And I still use that exercise. Yeah. As a way of just, bringing you into the moment. And yeah. And then in the, I think it was sort of mid-2000s, we did a show together in Space. 1998. Hijacked and myself in Space. And there's there's this sort of memories that I have of doing shows with people. So really my experience in contact really is about people. And say that it's not about the work, because it's kind of, you know, it is about the work, but it's also really, really about the people that I have met along the way. Cry. So speaking of, Dustin Haug and Tammin Totsky moved to town how many years ago? A lot. I mean,
5 or 6.
5 or 6?
7
7.
or 8, I would say.
7 or 8?
No,
Yeah. So they moved to town. I started working with them. They were connected to Martin Keogh, and we brought him in for a workshop or 2. Then that's where I met Leighton Ellis, and I believe Taja. Did you take that workshop? Mm-hmm. And then in the old Lethem space, Olive came to town, and I remember taking something, improvisation, I don't know what it was Contact, but I remember studying with you in the old Lethem space, which is over on Cedar, or was over on Cedar. And yeah. So what's that?
The old Bedlam place behind
Palmer's
Palmer's
Bar.
Bar.
Yeah.
Guild.
stuff.
Is that the old guild?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, the old guild.
Connecting myself.
Oh.
Yes.
It's not the exact same building
No,
as
it
the
isn't.
old guild.
No, it was behind the guild.
Yeah.
It was nearby. I don't know what it was. Probably a tire factory.
But there is a Cedar Avenue over in West Bank. If you're looking for a geographic number.
Yeah.
Okay, here we go. Right. There's a lot going on in this building. Yeah.
And your own teaching, Jane?
I teach at Carleton College, and I teach a contact improvisation class. And I've been doing that for, I think, about 10 years. And I have, you know, the most amazing experience of working with students who have never danced before and need a PE credit. And hearing that contact is really cool. So again, this, you know, it's like I get to work with and introduce this form to a lot of college students. And some of them, I mean, basically everyone loves it. They're very kind of, you know, at first afraid, of course, of the contact. But by the end of the 10 weeks, they're like, no, this class can't end. And I've tried to institute jams there, but it's really difficult just because of their schedule. They're very highly scheduled now, as you probably know, all students are. So, yeah, and it really is a contact improvisation class. I try to make it only that. So it's really simple skills of weight sharing, and I think that's important to be able to sort of feel what that feels like. And
We've been,
Yes.
Kristin has been laying the foundation around Patrick and Jane's stories, and now we're going to open it up to, we have special guests here to talk about contact improvisation and kind of fill in some of the gaps. We are recording this. If you're not interested in being recorded, there's a little blank spot on this side if you don't want the camera to find you, but otherwise I wanted to invite Linda, you want to start, or Rick, do you want to jump in and talk a little?
Sure.
Great.
I'm Rick Watson.
Speak up.
And I've been doing Contact since 1977, when Patrick was at a regional men's conference and I attended, and my body went, wow, this is home. Someone else said that. This is, it's playful, it has to do with paying attention to yourself, paying attention to others, just a lot of things that I was curious and interested about. So I was living up at my property north of Two Harbors at the time, and I was coming down about once a month. And so I came down a few months later and attended another workshop kind of thing. And Ross Chapin, who used to live here, was an architect, a longtime contact person from the past. He and Joan Applequist were doing a workshop at this conference, and I took it and I got more inspired. And I knew Joan because she had worked at she had been at a school I had worked at when she was in high school, a long-term school. So I knew her some, and so we were chatting afterwards. She said, well, how long have you been doing Contact? And I said, about 2 hours. And she said, wow, you really get it. You need to come and join the Sunday Jams. Sunday Jams were happening at the Dome at that time, I think. And then later at one of Patrick's spaces. So for a long time, whenever I came back into the city, I hooked up with the Jams. At that same time, Patrick and the people from Minneapolis Contact Works were doing workshops, as Patrick said, and he brought in a lot of people. And I'm going to check my notes to make sure I remember all of them. So I didn't, Steve wasn't here, but there was a lot of video that I saw of Steve doing things. So I feel like I got to know him some from that, especially one of his comments in one of the tapes where he said, well, it's kind of like, you know, when you play basketball, you know the court, you know your teammates, you know the feel of the ball, you know some possibilities, but then in the moment, you don't know what's going to happen. So he was putting it into a language to describe some of what he was doing in ways that I understood from playing sports when I was a kid. So that spoke to me a lot. But the other people that I worked with, Lisa Nelson, Danny Lepkoff, Nancy Stark-Smith, Randy Warshaw, Martin Keogh, Tom Trenda, who wasn't here, but I met him through the Traeger community, and he and I had some wonderful dances in the Traeger community at conferences. Alito, that was already mentioned, and Manuel was here several times. And I especially remember Ernie, and I especially remember him helping me find out some new things about some of the possibilities that I hadn't had before. And I've worked with Nancy about 3 different times out at Boulder when she was doing the work at Europa in the summers. And that was a treat. And I just feel like Nancy inspired me a lot. Partly she inspired me because she put things together. I remember her saying, well, let's warm up with coincidence and intention. And my brain at first went, well, coincidence and intention, those, how are you putting those together? And of course it was perfect, and I use that all the time. Now when I teach, you know, it's like I'm still using coincidence and intention. The other thing I appreciated about Nancy is I really appreciated that she was always open to questions, and she was always open to working with any and everybody that was there. So that's the other part about Contact. There's a lot of quality about it. And just, well, okay, you're new or you're experienced, it doesn't matter. you play and you play at the levels you can. So in terms of my journey, in '85, I became a Traeger practitioner, and the principles of Traeger and the principles of Contact are very similar. The formats are different, but the principles are very close. And so it was just, I learned Traeger much easier because I had a background in Contact. So it was just a delight to learn Traeger because it was so similar in lots of ways. At the same time, Leva Joy McDonald, who was part of the Contact Jam community and taking classes and stuff down there, she and I got together to play some at jams and liked it so much, we thought we should do some more. And so we started teaching together, and 16 years later, we finally stopped teaching together. But we worked together for a long time, and it was a delight about the thing about relationships where the equality again, working together. We would come in to the dance studio that we rented for playing to see what we might play with that week in class. And that's how we would decide what we might put out there for that week. And many, many times we'd come in and one of us would say, oh, I've been thinking about, and the other person would say, I was thinking about that too. And it was like, you know, whether it was sharing weight or what it was a simple thing or a complex thing, but it was like, we always were kind of on the same wave. And I'd never experienced working with somebody that way before. So it was really amazing. And she and I performed a lot at international conferences for the Traeger world. Did a lot of improv shows, some shows where we let the audience throw out some things to us. And the one I remember the most was the first time we performed for Traeger community, and we were doing some terms, like weight or counterbalance or whatever that had to do with contact, and we just threw it out to the audience, and somebody said monkey wrench. Had nothing to do with anything that I know of. But it was the kind of thing that really invites that curious, like, what are you going to do with that? And so that's the other part about Contact. It's just really fun. You get to play with things sometimes that you can't even imagine. I also was part of a group that performed from 1984 to at least 2002. I'm not sure how much longer after that we performed, but it was a group called Band Dance, had various configurations. But we performed at the May Day Festival every year, 84 to 2002. Also did a lot of other performing with other people, but in the Man Dance people, in the first performance, Michael Engel, Steve Potts, and Michael Reed and myself. And many, many other people in between. A couple that I wanted to mention just because they're close to my heart. Doug David Crockett, Michael Monahan, Sean Gashevsky, Bill Lloyd, and Derek Phillips. And Derek and I are still dancing weekly just to get together and hang out and play with Contact. Some other folks in the community. Jane Baleka was a dancer that I danced and performed with. Diane Elliott, Carol Horowitz down in Iowa brought some people down there, and so it was another opportunity to do a workshop with people. Oliva, I mentioned Tim Old, Catherine Larson, Wendy Oliver, Terry Cruzan. They taught me a lot from the early days of Contact Works. Cindy Stevens, Judith Howard. Judith and I have performed a number of times together. It's always a delight to work with her. Suzanne River. And Sharon Friedberg, who taught up at UMD for quite a while. She brought me, Jane, and Joan up there to do a performance and a workshop thing up there. So we were at UD a couple of times. So it's that kind of cross-community webbing that Patrick talked about. It's really exciting. So I'm sure I've left out some people. The one thing I did want to share is in 2002, I had my first hip replacement. And it was pretty scary, of course, and I didn't know, am I going to be able to do contact after this? And I didn't know. But Mandance was still operating, so I came in my crutches when I was recovering. And I was dancing with people with my crutches, and I was dancing with people with my cane when I transferred to the cane. And in that performance in 2002, we did a piece called it's a long time ago. So it's not what you can't do, but what can you do? And that's the spirit of contact that I still enjoy. So now with 2 hip replacements, I can still do contact and I can still teach. Although I don't do all the things I used to do.
Linda, go Linda.
Well, just briefly. When Rick talked about what you can do and what you can't, my most long, in-depth association with contact was through the danceability workshop, which the new dance lab did in 1994, which Jane talked about. And I just want to say, sometimes I feel like the outsider to contact. I actually saw the first performance of Contact Improvisation in 1972 at Oberlin College, and was just wowed by it. It was Steve Paxton, who had worked with a bunch of students, non-dancers, athletes, I think, and all of us were like, what is this? It was fascinating and beautiful to me. So I have always been attracted to contact improvisation and took several workshops. I was involved, I can't remember how, in the dance sport, some of those workshops. I've taken classes with Diane Elliott, who is a very important teacher of contact here and performer of contact. And I never really got it. You know, I like the rolling around in the contact, and, but the flying part, I just couldn't do. I just couldn't get that far. I felt like the way I felt about math. I could get so far, and then I couldn't go any further. But when we did the danceability project, I was not part of it, but I watched every session, and it was Nancy Mason Hauser, I wanted to point out, who made this wonderful documentary. And I just want to tell 2 little stories about that. One was a contact workshop, which Alito and Chris gave. It was sort of open to the public, as I remember. And it was in some gym somewhere. I don't even remember where. But I was part of that. I participated in that. And that was with the differently abled dancers, especially Emery Blackwell and Bonnie Dunn, who are professional dancers from Alito's company. And at one point, I was rolling around on the floor with Bonnie Dunn. And Bonnie Dunn, who Jane described, had severe neurological problems. She had been raped and practically strangled and left in a ditch to die. And I think she also had, as a result of that, had a stroke. So she had many problems, and one of them was she could only speak in a whisper. And so I'm rolling on the floor with Bonnie, and she says to me, "Give me all your weight." I am. No, you're not. And of course, it made me realize, here's this woman, she's got all these problems. I'm not going to give her all my weight. That was, the part of me that I didn't realize subconsciously was saying that. And I will never forget that, because it kind of loosened something up in me. And it was the first time I felt I really experienced contact with Bonnie Dunn. And the other little story about the danceability workshop I want to tell, the lab was not just about us working in the studio and no one watching us. We had many different groups of people come into the studios to watch what was going on. And one day, for the danceability workshop, a group of mentally disabled people from a community center came in to watch rehearsal. And so they were sitting and watching. You saw a little of it on the tape. And we had not planned to actually work with people to have them do contact, but something happened. I think one of the guys got up or something, or Alito came and got him, and our dancers started doing some of the simpler weight shift, counterbalance things with the people who were sitting there. And then one guy said, let's do a story. Not this abstract bullshit. Let's do so I think Alito said, well, what would you like to do? Let's do the Wizard of Oz. And he started assigning parts to various dancers. You're Toto.
I was Toto.
You were Toto. Catherine was the witch. You know, somebody was Dorothy, and they all got up, all these people got up, and we all started moving, but by the end of it, we were all moving around the room singing, we're off to see the wizard. And the people who were in charge of, you know, this daycare center came up to us afterwards. They were astounded. They said they had never seen anything like this. The whole group of them, you know, responding the way they did. And there was one guy, they told us, I don't know if you remember this, Jane. One guy he would never talk to anyone. He was always by himself, isolated. No one could touch him.
I think I actually worked with him.
And he got up and participated. It was a miracle! The miracle of contact, so.
Bartlett. I think, Jeff, you should kind of, what are your memories of contact improvisation in the Twin Cities?
Well, let's see. This is true, right? I'm the first and only non-dancer to stand up.
Not true.
Well, it's pretty true. So I'm Jeff Bartlett. I'm a dance lighting designer, and I ran the Southern Theater primarily as a dance venue for many, many years, more than a quarter of a century. My career at that building began in the storied 1970s that we've been hearing so much about, when it was opened up by the Guthrie Theater at that time as a second space for the Guthrie called Guthrie 2. Guthrie 2 opened up in 1976 and ran through 79. Guthrie 2, when it was first formed, was formed as a second space for the Guthrie, and as such it had a resident company of equity actors that performed theater plays at 8 o'clock. But at 10:30, the visionary artistic director at the time, whose name was Eugene Lyon, who now lives in Canada, had this idea called the 1030 series. And the 1030 series was basically a stage for community groups to come and use the space. And it was open to a huge range of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, hard to categorize, local people. Dance artists, illusion mime theater performed there before they were illusion. Barbara Berlovitz and Dominique Serran performed there before they were Jean Loon. And Patrick just reminded me that the first time I ran into this group of contact dancers was at the Guthrie 2. I worked my way into being the guy who did the lighting for the 1030 series. And after just one short season, the equity company aspect of the Guthrie project tanked. And so, but the Guthrie had a 3-year lease on the building, and so from being one person among a huge organization, all of a sudden, literally overnight, I became kind of the guy running the space. And we started playing host to all these groups from the Twin Cities, including some groups from right down the street, down Cedar Avenue, where the Guild of Performing Arts was, and also, nothing to do with this particular track, but the space that's now the Cedar Cultural Center had been a movie theater that was used by Minnesota Dance Theater in the back in the way early days. So, was Mary Cerny involved in that first show that you guys did at the Guthrie 2? Do you know?
She would have been in England by then.
She would have been in England, okay. So, somehow or another, through this Guthrie 2 project, played host to, I'm pretty sure now, that it was Contact Works before it was yet actually Contact Works. Is there a chance that
we would Contact Work too?
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure about that. Sorry about the not being sure part. But now, my personal story is that I moved to Minneapolis after having, at a time in my life when I was trying to figure out what it was that I wanted to do with my life. And I wasn't really sure. But within a few months of moving to Minneapolis, 3 things happened. I walked into the building, which was then the Guthrie 2, which then became the Southern A. B, I discovered dance lighting. And C, I discovered the independent performing artists of the Twin Cities. And I fell in love with all 3 of them all at the same time, all at once in 1976. And so those forces started to drive my life really for the next quarter century, and in many ways still do. It was a very kind of heady time, and it was a time when I think I wasn't the only person who felt this way, who really kind of felt, and this of course was an outgrowth of the 60s and Woodstock and all that, where we really felt like if we just did really good, important, valuable things in the world, that we would change the world. We could literally change the world with our efforts. Art was incredibly important in this somehow. And so, I don't know, maybe it's just me, but for myself, that period of time was this time when anything could be possible. And if you just found the right combination of people and did the right stuff, you could just do anything. And it really had that kind of quality about it. So I remember these guys came, and I can't remember the details of how it worked out, but they asked me if I would improvise lighting for their show, and I was all over it. I'm self-taught as a lighting designer. I didn't go to school for lighting design, so I didn't know that you weren't supposed to do that. I was like, sure, of course, why not? You guys are improvising, I can improvise. I got handles here, I can do the thing. I can do that, I'll do this. And I remember, memory's a funny thing. So maybe this was those guys, and maybe it was a different performance, not sure which, but whatever it was. There was, the piece began in the dancers took their place in black, on an empty stage and formed a big pile of people. And and that was set, and I had a special that was focused on that, where that group was. And on some either time cue or music cue, my job was to fade the lights up ever so slowly, just like, that crossing that fantastic threshold from invisibility into visibility and all the cool things that happen when you write down in that range of what are you seeing and everything. And it was really cool. It was a beautiful opening, and it was very fun to do. And I remember we did that, and then as I recall, it then migrated out into a performance of improvised lighting and dance. And I just remember after the show, as we would do, we hung out in the lobby, and the dancers were like, there's that moment, and we're in the dark, and the light comes up, and he's like, yeah, we are like, yeah, he's with us. And that, for me, was like, oh, you know that I'm with, I mean, for me, that was one of the kind of quintessential events in my understanding that it was good for me to be a dance lighting designer. And that as a dance lighting designer, I can make a direct, very palpable, if not actual physical, body kind of connection with the work. And that became, you know, very, very, and remains very important to my work as a dance lighting designer. So, mostly, I don't dance. Mostly, I don't show up on stage. Mostly, I don't like being on stage at all. Mostly, I'm not really very much in my body, even. But, little known fact about Jeff Bartlett, I took one and only one dance class. Contact Improvisation. Contact with Joanne Tillemans at the Contact Works studio in Cityscape, which was this complex that then became Xenon Studios for a while. But before that, it housed Contact Works, it housed the Palace Theater Company, which we could do a whole 2 hours just on the history of that amazing experimental theater group. And also Mindy Ratner had a...
Mindy Melman.
Mindy
Melman.
Yes, the other Mindy, not Ratner, that would be that one. Anyway, so there were 3 independent but sort of related performing spaces in that studio. And so even though I wasn't and am not a dancer, there was something about Contact that welcomed me in as a non-dancer and made me feel like I could do it, and I did, and I understood what all those things were that they were talking about in a physical way, the whole weight. Oh, that's what you mean by weight, you know, weight bearing, supporting weight, sharing weight, and taking risk. And I remember that. And I had wanted to say too that was one of the things that made Contact Improv really interesting for me as an audience member when I first saw it, was this way in which, and I was actually sorry to hesitate speaking so weirdly right now, but I was relieved to see this stuff on video and realize that my memory of it was actually pretty accurate. It wasn't some spun, you know, reconstruction that happened by the passing of years, where there was that, I don't know if you all felt it, but for me, there's this sort of refreshing kind of innocent kind of quality about, yeah, we're having fun, but you're welcome in to our fun. It wasn't insular in the sense that we're doing this and you guys can do whatever you want out there. And neither was it like, look at us, aren't we great? You know, how cool. It was this really interesting balance between, you know, involving the audience and doing work that was based on what each other was doing on stage. So I really liked that, and I really enjoyed the opportunity to participate in it in my own sort of halting way. One of my most vivid memories of that class, and one of my most vivid memories ever, and I don't know if it'll mean much to anyone but me, but I have to tell you. So this studio was on 5th, was it? Or
5th Avenue and 4th Street.
Right.
Between 3rd and 4th.
So if you go up 5th north towards the river, right now you're pretty much smack into the whole Crown Mill and Guthrie complex. At the time, the Guthrie wasn't there, and that whole area was a little bit abandoned. For whatever reason, there was this gigantic pile of sand that went, or something, I think it was sand, that went from essentially like where the Guthrie is, all the way down to the river. That whole hillside was covered with sand. And one night after class, Joanne said, we're going to practice disorientation. And so we went out there, and for a solid hour, we just rolled down that hill, and then we climb up, and we roll down it again. So it's very hard for me to ever be over there. I'm pretty sure that the performance where Steve ended up asleep in Jane's house was called 9999. Does that ring a bell? Whether it was that particular show or not, I was also very involved with Contact during the Chris Aiken era, and I think my improvised lighting kind of took a step up. Chris and company would be very interested in setting up a structure, like a structure of, I remember for one work we did a structure of parallel alleyways along the whole stage, and then some other very physical things. When I worked with Chris and Peter in Ohio, we set up a series of triangles and trapezoids. So we would always enjoy setting up a set geography, but then of course the way that geography got used in the work was completely improvised. But I really felt like that was kind of the pinnacle of my work as an improvising lighting artist, and I was very happy to be doing so. And again, one of my most treasured memories is of Mike Steele mentioning my work and saying that I was somehow adept at this kind of work or something like that. And Mike Steele in his review talked about how sometimes I would respond to the dancers, and sometimes I would move the dancers with my lighting. So that was fun. It was a really interesting way, and I'm not sure if I would have been able to interact quite in that way if I hadn't actually taken the class and so I could be on stage without being on stage. That's my life.
James, do you want to jump in and talk about your history with Contact Improvisation?
Talk a little bit. James Soul. It goes back to very shortly after we moved to town in '93. We started our Valley Works project where we would have local other artists come and work on the dancers. And Patrick was the first person that ever came in to work with us, I think. It was right off the bat. This would have been probably 95 or
Sally wrote 94.
5. Anyway, and I'm sure it must have been Sally's idea to have him in. I honestly can't remember exactly, but it had a profound effect on the company and how we worked over the years. Starting, I remember you were so brilliant because you realized, I think, you brought language into it right off the bat with us. And something a bunch of bunhead ballet dancers had never talked while dancing. And not only did it make us, I think, realize we're not in Kansas anymore in a number of different ways, but also ballet is actually a great language to improvise with because we have this shared vocabulary that we improvise with. And I think the connection of words, realizing how every conversation is an improvisation with words that we all share and know, I think there was a changeover that happened with our minds in terms of seeing the vocabulary that we had developed as dancers, ballet dancers, as words that we could use in that way, and it kind of bridged, at least for me, a mental gap in that way. After that, we got connected, because we were friends also with Chris Aiken and Kathy. Sally sort of organized this thing called Bass Night Out, and it was this 5 different bass players from the Minnesota Orchestra and the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra had this concert, and we were, my company and Chris Aiken, were just improvising for about an hour and a half throughout the evening. You were sort of up and down, in and out, and it was just this sort of happening. And Christian Burns, who was in the company at the time, who went on to actually be a performing and life partner of Christy Simpson, was dancing. And I'll never forget watching this performance and seeing Chris, first Chris Aiken partnering Sally on point, improvising with her with Contact and some ballet, and then Christian Burns taking that to something I'd never seen, which was an improvised classical pas de deux. Moving in and out of the classical vocabulary, the contact vocabulary, in a way that really blew my mind. I'd never seen anything. I didn't know that was possible. And I had been one of those ballet dancers, oh, no, I don't improvise. That was just like, when you're trained in that, that's not what you do. And so it really expanded my understanding of what was remotely possible. And, so then was inspired and sort of dove into that community and started, taking classes with a lot of the contact upstairs with Chris and remember performing with Chris and with you and many people in town. And what I loved about it was I loved being a beginner and again, with a form. Having this, I don't know if you ever master anything, but, having a command of the ballet language, all of a sudden having to start over and have this sort of wide-eyed, bushy-tailed beginner, I'm discovering my body in a new way, kind of then expanded how I looked at how I did ballet choreography. And I'll be forever thankful for this community in the Twin Cities that was so embracing and open. There was never a sense of, oh, you do this, you do that. We were just there, we were exploring, we were influenced, and then, within my company, then bringing in people to perform. Chris performed with my company on stage at O'Shaughnessy, as did Christian Burns and Christy Simpson, and it really was fun. I know it was fun for Kirsty coming in. She was saying usually she would go to a community and they would have, 1 or 2 performances. And with us, we had 6 performances over 2 weekends with the same 6 people to be able to kind of dive in deeper. And it's something our company then started. The influence, it got to the point where we were having 15 to 20 minute completely open improvisations, open score improvs in every performance. And we would pick them, either be improvised music or we would pick the music an hour or 2 before the performance. I would maybe tell the dancers what the music was going to be, so they know what was the first song and what they would know to be ending on. And when you hear this song, this is the last one. Why find your ending? So and it was really it was cool to be able to do that. And today the influence is more my structures flow in and out of improv and set structures. We don't as often, though we do sometimes do completely open scores, but it has found its way inexorably into that. Now, the last influence, I think, one of the things I love about contact improvisation is how almost anything can take it and find a way to use, once your body understands these mechanisms of connection, of listening, of leading, following, it's anything, whether it's sport or dance, I think, can find a way to embrace that. And something I was exposed to Argentine tango about 4 years ago, started doing that and realizing its closest cousin is contact improvisation, the lead and the follow, but it was only a one-way conversation, which immediately frustrated me. So as soon as I learned something, I want to change it. Can't help it. So I started teaching Sabina Ibis, who was my tango partner. She was teaching me tango. I started teaching her contact improvisation as best I could, in order to kind of say, well, we've got this improvisational thing. How do we change the lead? How do we pass it back and forth? How do we rotate chair bounce in different ways? So then Sabina's been taking the contact class sometimes with you upstairs with Hijack. And so I think it's another way that this community has brought the improvisation, into the tango community. And we've been holding some workshops for tango people to kind of be, time these things in. So it continues to wind its way forward, and that's what I got.
Kristin, you want to talk about your Hijack's work in Contact Improv?
Sure. Arwen Wilder and I moved here in 1993. We met as students at Colorado College. We were quite isolated. I'd never heard of contact improvisation, but we noodled around and improvised a lot there. And when we moved here, we started, we did a massive catch-up on what is contemporary dance. Luckily, I was an apprentice at Xenon, oddly, that first year, and started taking class, especially with Jane Shockley. And for most of those first few years, I could take often 4 classes a week.
evening space-based classes in the morning, Xenon classes. And I don't think Chris's Wednesday class was happening in '93, but soon after that. So I was doing the full Xenon, Monday ballet, Tuesday modern, Wednesday contact, Thursday modern, Friday jazz with Kathy Young every week. And so I believe my first exposure to contact was the tangents in Jane's class. And then I always went to Chris's class until he left here, moved to Pennsylvania first, 99, 2000, and he passed the Wednesday morning class on to High Jackson, and teaching that for 15 years almost. I was a total junkie for New Dance Lab. I'd go to every lunchtime showing. I saw, just as a total fan, a lot of what's been described today. Body Logic were massively influential, seeing them at the Southern. In the early 90s, Hijack formed another collaborative called Concrete Farm with Morgan Thorson and Kelly Tennyson and Winona Sorensen from Carlton. And we, in so many ways, were reinventing the wheel. It was a very kind of Grand Union style collective, and we would research together about 20 hours a week, every week for 2 years, until we did a culminating show called Scout at the Southern with Jeff Litt. We also often brought Jennifer Monson into town, and Jennifer Monson was massively influential. In 1997, we carpooled with Cindy Stevens to CI 25, and Olive was there, and Rosie Seamus was there, and Chris Aiken and Danielle Beaver were there.
Where was that?
Megan Flint. It was at Oberlin. Megan wasn't there. So that was total kid in the candy store. I first saw Image Lab and Lisa Nelson, and it changed my life. So KJ Holmes comes up here. She taught a class at Center for Performing Arts. Almost everybody we were encountering out in the world eventually came to Minneapolis for class. So we were getting Jennifer Monson. After we met, after Hijack met Karen Nelson at CI 25, we started bringing here for workshops. And we got to do 3 or 4 so far, and there's another one that BodyCartography is coming in November. Through her, I met Margaret Gallanter of Seattle/Oakland, and she has come in often to teach. And there's been a lot of flow to travel out of Minneapolis to study that I feel is really influential, because I've met, I really got to know Otto Ramstad, whose name is driving me crazy, at the Bright Bush Jam. And I went to Bright Bush because Jane said it was cool. And Jane Shockley brought Jess Curtis to town, and it was amazing, and I got to pick him up at the airport. Yeah. And I was hung out around the Improv Summit as much as I was allowed, and it was at the old Patrick's Cabaret. So it was a tiny space, and there really wasn't room for extra hanger-arounders. So we had to figure out how to be polite and participate when possible. In 2010, Otto and I went to Earth Dance to study material for the spine of Steve Paxton. say we performed a duet right when we got back at Ball's Cabaret in Southern. And I should go back and say when I got back from CI 25, we performed duets at Ball's Cabaret every single Saturday for 3 months. And it was pure contact improvisation called Don't Get Me Wrong, I Worship at the Shrine. The trio we performed with Jane Shockley at Hijack's Tax Return at Space Space was called I Am Not Responsible for My Actions. And then 2011 through 13, I think, Steve Paxton and Lisa Nelson taught an ongoing 3-part intensive at Earth Dance that I also did along with Jennifer Arvey and Sarah Bomber, another local dancer. So there's been a lot of concrete farming to Amsterdam studying with Julian Hamilton. A lot of examples being set by Jane Shockley and critic, and any name they would drop, or someone, Peter Bingham would come here, or Andrew Harwood, and then we would all go run and get another week-long workshop out of town and come back. I want to just throw another name up here, and that is Colin Rush.
Yes, thank you.
And so I'll just make a segue and say Colin Rush and Sean Smuda. Is he still here? He's gone. Performed a hijack duet called Gertrude Stein in our 10-year anniversary show at the Bartlett. And that was a contact improvisation duet.
My name's Otto Ramstad. My name is Otto Ramstad. I grew up in Minneapolis. I think maybe I studied with Suzanne River from 1981 to 1989. I was like 6 till 14. And then I stopped dancing for a fair amount of time. And then I started to get in college on the West Coast of Washington. And then I did, it was the first time I did contact there with someone that had done work with Sarah Shelton Man, but in retrospect, it wasn't really contact improvisation. It was like doing dance and then like jumping on each other. It was not that really in depth. Just doing that, and then I dropped out of college and was just doing workshops. And at a certain point, I moved back to Minneapolis in 1998, and I took several workshops at Xena, and that's how I met Kristin and Arwen and Morgan Thorson and all the people from Concrete Farm. And I went to a show that they did at Intermedia Arts with Jennifer Monson. And then I remember talking to Arwen, and I guess she was like, well, you were really busy when you were around. I'm sorry we didn't dance more, but we're going to Brighton Bush. You should go there, and then we can dance. And then I did go to there, and then that's where I met Steve Paxton and Karen Nelson and Margaret. KBL mentioned, and then Karen Nelson gave me a scholarship to go to her event called First Dance, which was in Shawn, Washington, and that's where I met Ollie. This was in 1999. 99. Not sorry, 99. 1999. And then I moved to San Francisco with Paula, and we were there until I was there for 2001. But we did a month-long project in Minneapolis in 2000 where we did improvisation interventions around Minneapolis for a month, and we were supposed to be with KBL, and with Arwen. KBL got injured, and it was just Colin, Arwen,
And David Wick.
David Wick.
And then I think Megan Flood and maybe Janelle Diva participated at some point.
And then we moved here in 2001. And I just add Colin Rush, and I also worked with Colin Rush a lot. We did a series at Sean Smith's Space. Performance series. We also had a improvisation practice series with Jane and Danelle. That was at a church in St. Paul. Also,
And Patrick Kane also, we had a jam, but we had musicians or a different focus every week, so it wasn't primarily contact, but contact, of course, was like the shared language for everybody.
and we did that for a while.
Calhoun Building.
The Calhoun Building.
The Calhoun Building, right, and in the upstairs, Chris Watson space, and then at the Armenian church.
Also somewhere upstairs here.
Okay.
That's my
So I first studied contact in the 90s, in the late 80s, early 90s in London, and I'm going to figure out the name, Gabby, whose last name I can't remember right now, maybe someone else can remember it. But then also I studied with Karen and KJ as part of my education in the Netherlands, and with Lisa and Steve. And so those were sort of grounding forces for me in forming my work. And I think once I came out of school, I ended up going into the danceability training, going to CI25, and really wanting to kind of bridge this space between these beautiful studios and the rest of the world. And in a way, that's how BodyCartography started, was really in this appetite or desire to bring these practices out into public spaces. And then we lived in San Francisco. I lived in San Francisco for 5 years, and I was very immersed in 848. And taught a lot at the jam at 848. And so that was the whole Keith Hennessy, Jess Curtis, all of Stephanie Maha, everyone you know in San Francisco and Santa Cruz. Rosie was living in Santa Cruz at that time. Rosie Simez. Many names, and I was also an organizer of the West Coast Contact Festival. And then we moved here in 2001, and I feel like mostly been teaching contact improvisation within what we do as dance makers and as improvisers and as body mind centering teachers versus teaching extensively or exclusively contact improvisation classes, although we did teach for the 30th anniversary and have taught some for you several times over the years. And and so here we are back at this series now, which Wendy Rubel, who I was hoping would be here, kind of initiated in a way. So now there's this, energy happening again around the film, which you should come to class. And Karen Nelson is coming to town on the 22nd and 23rd of November, which is the same weekend that Steve and Lisa are performing at the Walker. So if you're interested in knowing more, you can talk to me or go to BodyCartography website. I don't know if I have more to add.
We are, it's past 4, but I wanted to spend some time hearing from the audience. So if you want to stay and keep telling stories, and we can kind of map into part of your stories and time with contact improvisation. And I just wanted to mention why we're mapping and why we're facing this big white wall is something that an inspiration that came to me after talking with Sage Cowles last summer, when I said, I'm going to start working at the Cowles Center. She said, you've got to do something about that big white wall. And I knew immediately which wall she was talking about. And I thought about how this building has so much history in it, but the influences through the different people and communities that have passed through the doors is not apparent anymore. So the mapping is about seeing the people and the influences that we've had on each other in this community and whether influencing potentially a mural. So that's kind of the seeds of what this mapping is about, to see our connections together, but to also to see how it's affected a community, and to the point of building a building, or connecting two buildings to one another. It's funny, I highlighted this from the newsletter that was the New Dance Lab. After the Danceability Project, there was an essay, and it starts, is this dance? Is it therapy? Is it education? Is it art? Why am I doing this? And I feel like we've been kind of circling around these themes through today's talk. And I think it's really important that this is being hosted at the Cowles Center for Dance and the Performing Arts. And I'll give a quick plug to the others in this lecture series. You've heard about the other contact dance events happening around town leading up to Steve Paxton's performance and lecture at the Walker. In January, we're doing the same format, different people about spaces, and I've already been collecting names. You know, the Guild of Performing Arts has come up, Ozone Studio. I did not know about David's studio above French, New French.
David Critchlet.
Yeah, so I'll get this going. But Guthrie 2, the 1030 series, and Cityscape, there's some great spaces that have made up the history in the community. So in January, we're doing a lecture on legendary spaces. In March, educational outcomes, so dance that's been put in the schools, and developing dances in May, and that's about Works in Progress series. Also writing about dance, and I think Mike Steele's name's come up a few times, and I think that's an important kind of local influence on putting language to dance. So this is a resource, and it's exciting to see how all of this is starting to play out, and it's just the first step. But I wanted to open it up. I don't know if you need to leave, then absolutely, but if others want to stick around and tell their stories, you're welcome.
I just want to say, this is so beautiful.
Awesome, it's awesome. What about projections of these over time on this wall?
Yeah.
I forgot to mention, I brought copies of some reviews of dance that Chris and I did together, and then Unsafe Unsuited with Keith and Ishmael that I have copies of here. And on the backside of the Keith and Ishmael review, I have the YouTube links to the things that I showed today or talked about, so that you can take that with you if you'd like. I'll leave it on the front desk over here.
Judith?
I wanted to thank everybody who participated, and I wish we had time to introduce everybody to each other, but I've been a long time observer of what goes on, and writer and participant choreographically, and I wanted to bring up a person who I wish you could all take the time to answer her connection, but I was a student in New York when Anna Halpern was quite in, and by 1967, her knowledge of tasks supporting dancers by falling onto each other, doing all kinds of assignments that she would propose about how to support each other and how to do all the things that you've been mentioning, became foremost in her mind. And a dancer who studied with her was Marilyn Wood, who made dance scores in public spaces. And she revived, for example, Central Park by her single-handed use of changing it at New Year's Eve and making it safe for the public to dance together there. And I brought Marilyn Wood to Walker Art Center in 1970, where she did dance scores and all kinds of events, basically coming out of Anna Halpern's work. And of course, Anna Halpern's husband created the Nicollet Mall, and which has been quite changed. We won't say ruined since.
What's his name?
Lawrence Halpern. And Lawrence and Anna did all kinds of important things together. And at the dance sport conference that Patrick brought up, Anna and Steve got the 2 major awards, and they did improvise together, and so it's another name out there I'd like to remind.
Taja, you want to say a little something?
Can you introduce yourself more loudly so we all know?
I'm Taja Will, and I am the youngest generation of contact teacher. I've been teaching contact nationally, a little bit internationally for about 7 years, and I've been here about 7 years now. It's really a passion of mine. I came from Iowa, where Jane Hawley, who's my most instrumental contact teacher, had one of the only programs in the country of somatic movement and contact improvisation, only on the collegiate level. No ballet, no modern. And so I came out of that and followed the trail of BodyCartography and Morgan Thorson and a few others here, where I met Hijack, who's also been really instrumental in my practice. And then I took over jams for a while, along with Dustin and Tammin. And my 10-year collaborative partner, Blake Nellis, joined me here after a couple of years. And we have hosted jams. We've tried to keep them going, even through the ebbs and flows of interest around contact here in the Twin Cities. I've hosted 3 Minneapolis chapters of You Come, We'll Show You What We Do, that kind of original invitation to watch contact improvisation happening. Twice, that was very informal, and then in 2010 I did a more formal version of it as a guest curator at Patrick's Cabaret. And I guess I feel like I'm an advocate for the form. I teach, again, nationally quite often, more so than even right here, studying work this next year at Brown University, very specifically with scientists and contact improvisers, teaching out in Connecticut, teaching at the new structured jam festival in the Bay Area. And the Twin Cities is just so vibrant in our dance scene, and I really have a mission to keep contact alive here. And so I'm trying to do my part in that and perform it and continue teaching these intersections of partnering in contact improvisation and improvisation. Hijack speaks a little bit about this, contact improvisation and how they are actually very different, and there is duet improvisation. And so part of this is all of my research. How do we integrate that as contemporary dance makers, as educators, as people interested in touch and what that is in contact? Is it therapy? Is it a dance form creating more dance? All of these things are my research, and so I love talking about it. I love following the flavors of contact on the different coasts. We all have kind of a different flavor there, and going into and out of those and over to Europe and feeling that flavor and bringing it back. I've also curated several guest artists here, along with the help of others for performances. I just brought Chris Aiken and his current wife and partner, Angie Hauser, recently, and we had a great workshop. And really hoping to do more of that along with these people who support me so well.